Thank you. Chan, I'll just start with this. Chan is like a React wizard, and I obviously am not, as I'm unplugging my HDMI cable. And if you guys don't get offended easily and like strong opinions, you should follow him on Twitter, because there's some good stuff on there about React from time to time. So I'm Jeffrey Lessel. I work here at Planning Center. I'm a Ruby dev, but I have been dabbling in Elixir, and I've really, really, really enjoyed it. Have you guys tried out Elixir yet? Who's taken a stab at Elixir? All right, yeah, Jesse. Okay, one person. Well, today I'm going to talk a little bit about Elixir and something called Ecto. Have you guys heard of Phoenix? It's kind of a buzzword right now. Phoenix is kind of like the Rails for Elixir. It's a framework where you can do stuff on the web with Elixir. Super fast, super cool. So what is Ecto? Ecto is a database, basically wrapper. It's something that makes using a database super easy in Elixir. Straight out of the docs, it says Ecto is a domain-specific language for writing queries and interacting with databases in Elixir. As boring as you'd expect from documentation. So it's kind of like, if you guys are familiar with Rails, it's kind of like Active Record for Rails. It basically ties your code and the database together, so you don't have to write SQL. It will do all that for you. It doesn't specifically tie to a specific database. You can see here that it works with Postgres, works with MySQL, MS SQL, SQLite3, MongoDB. There's been a new release within the past couple months. They just released a version 2, and those last 3 actually don't work with version 2 yet, but they're working on that. But the major ones that most likely you'll be using on most of your projects, if you're kind of in the open source world, is Postgres and MySQL anyway. So the cool thing about this is you can switch from one database to the next without really having to rewrite any of your code. You just plug in a different adapter, and your code will work the same with that new adapter. So if I wrote all this in Postgres, which I'm going to tonight, I'm going to do a little bit of live coding, and we're going to write it as plugging into a Postgres database. But if for some reason we needed to move over to a MySQL database, we could do that with just changing basically one word, literally, which is really cool. In fact, this afternoon, I had basically just done a lot of updating and reinstalling things on my dev machine this week. And as I was preparing this afternoon, realized that Postgres wasn't working for me locally. So I was like, oh, great, this is going to be horrible. But I was like, that's all right, I'll just use MySQL. But I got it working. Someone used Postgres because that's the default. All right, so here's tonight's goals. Since a lot of you aren't familiar with Elixir, and especially since you're not familiar with Elixir, you won't be familiar with Ecto, we're just going to have some really... We're not going to aim very high, basically. So I'm just going to show you how fast and easy it is to get started with Elixir. With Ecto in your Elixir project. We're going to set up a project. We're going to get Ecto in there, and we're going to do some basic database manipulation with that. Then demonstrate some of the power of Ecto and Elixir while we're at it, since not a whole lot of people in here are familiar with Elixir. And also just give you guys a little bit of interest in maybe going out and looking at some of this information on your own to get more info. All right, so unlike Chan, I'm not really a slide guy. He's a slide guy. I'm just like, hey, let's get into the terminal and mix stuff up. So to create a new project in Elixir, we use something called mix.new, or mix.new. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. One of the cool things about Elixir is that it has a lot of really good built-in help. From the main source code all the way through different projects, there's a good emphasis on making sure that everything is documented well, and it has inline documentation on most of the stuff, and it has really good tools to expose that documentation to you when you need it. So for me, when I like learning new stuff, I like to learn how to find stuff out. Like if I don't know something and I have to Google it, that's one thing. It's usually right, leaves me a Stack Overflow or something. But I like knowing how to find the information on my own. So I'm going to show you how to do that real quick. So if you type mix help, it'll show you everything that it can do. Mix is kind of like Rake for Ruby, and it basically just has a suite of tools that you can use to interact with an application, an Elixir application. So you can see here we have a few different things. We want to create a new application, so let's just look through here, see if we find a new. Mix new creates a new Elixir project. That's kind of what we want to do here. So let's do that. So mix, we don't know how to do it, so we can do mix help new. And that'll give you some of the inline documentation for how to use mix new. So here it says we give it a path name, which is going to be our project name unless we specify otherwise. And one other thing I want to point out is this SUP option. It can generate a OTP application skeleton, including a supervision tree. And again, since not a whole lot of familiarity with Elixir in here, basically one of the cool things about Elixir is it can spawn off all these child processes and have, they're called workers, and they can have a supervisor supervising those workers. And if one of the workers dies, the supervisor can start another one up in its place. So your project is really reliable, which is really cool. But anyway, what we want to do is we want to create an application that uses a supervisor, because we want to make sure our database connection, if it goes down, is restarted quickly for us, and it's going to be like it never went away. So we're going to do mix new. We're going to create this the to-do application, to-do, and we're going to give it the sup option. Okay, so just like if you did Rails new or something like that, it gives you a skeleton, an outline of an application. So let's go ahead and go into our to-do application here. Is this a good size for you guys? You see it? Okay, cool. I'm going to make it just a little bit bigger because I have the space. All right, now that we have an application, let's start getting Ecto in there, okay? So we have Elixir, let's do Ecto. So I'm going to go into Emacs here, and the first thing we want to open is our mix.exs file. Yes, okay. So in here, this is kind of like a whole bunch of different things in Rails put together. This is like your application file where it tells you how to start the application. It's also like a gem file that you can tell it what dependencies your application is going to need, which is really cool. So we're going to go tell it what our dependencies are, because we want to be able to use Ecto in our application. So this deps here, it will define our dependencies. So let's in here create a couple dependencies. The first is one called postgrex. And that is basically the adapter that marries Ecto and Postgres on our machine. And we give it a version. And then we also want Ecto, the star of our talk tonight. And we want to make sure that we've got at least version 2.0 in there. All right. From there, in this applications here, this is where we tell our application what other applications we want it to start. And so I mentioned how the supervisor kind of makes sure everything is going correctly. Well, this is telling it, hey, we want to make sure these things are happening when we run our application. So in here, we want to make sure we start up both Ecto and Postgres. Now, when I mentioned that if we needed to move to MySQL, this is one of the places where we would change a couple things. Instead of Postgres, we would use one called MariaX. And that's just the MySQL adapter. We would just replace Postgres with MariaX. And then one other place, which I'll show you here in a minute. The reason I like to do something like this when I'm learning something new is I have databases already from past projects, and it's data. And I like dealing with data and trying to create an application that uses that data. And so if I can somehow get into that database and start coding around playing with that, then that to me is a win. So I love how fast and easy it is in Elixir to do that. So let's exit out of this. Actually, I'm not going to exit. I'm going to leave it up, but I'm going to tab over to our term. I don't know why that is up. And we can look at, actually, let's do mix.deps.get. This will get all our dependencies pretty quick. And then we can do mix compile. Now, Elixir is a compiled language, which is one of the reasons why it's crazy fast. But we do need to compile things from time to time. And a lot of times when you do something on your own, it'll compile it for you. But it's, as you can see, it's pretty quick to compile. Now, if we do mix help again, we can see that we've been, a couple more options have been included here. So now we have these mix ectos. So another cool thing about mix is you can have packages or modules plug into the mix subsystem and give you more options on what you can do within mix. So we want to, in this case, create a new repo. And a repo in the Ecto world is just like a repository. It's basically how your database is connected. And that'll make more sense here in a minute. I will mention as well that I'm going to be going a little quick, as you can tell. This talk was originally written for an 1.5-hour talk, and I've got 20 minutes, so I'm going to try to compile it all down as fast as I can and skip some things and hope to give you a taste of what we can do with Ecto. So let's do Ecto gen repo, and this will give you an error. Now, another cool thing about the way Elixir does things is it's built on top of Erlang, and Erlang has a whole bunch of crazy, complex, weird error messages that are sometimes hard to figure out, hard to parse. And unfortunately, Elixir has some of those too, because a lot of Elixir is just piping straight to Erlang, and Erlang bubbles up those errors, and then it presents that to you, and you're like, I have no idea what that means. But a lot of times, Elixir is nice on its error messages. So here it tells you exactly what we need to do. It says, warning, could not find repositories for application to do. You can avoid this warning by passing the R flag or by setting the repositories managed by this application in your config/config.exs file. And it even gives you the code you want. So let's do that. That's the way we want to do it. Let's go back to our Emacs, and we're going to edit config.config. So we'll go to config.config. Yes. OK. So in here, go back over to iterm. This is what it says we need to do. Config our to-do application with our Ecto repos. I'm just going to paste that in. Actually, my paste isn't working. There we go. And then I'm going to change this. And we can call our repo anything we want to. And this is where we name it. So I'm just going to call it to-do.repo. That's kind of the standard way of doing it. So now that we have that in there, we'll ask, again, mix to create our repo. And it does. So we did mix ecto gen repo. It created a couple things for us. It created our lib to-do directory. It also created a repo.ex file, which is where we'll define how our repo interacts with the application. And then it even gives you this helpful thing. Don't forget to add your new repo to your supervision tree, typically in lib/todo.ex. And this is what we need to add. So let's do that. Let's go to lib/todo.ex. Lib/todo.ex. All right, in here, under children, this is where we define our supervisors, or what is being supervised. And so I'm going to, as it suggested, paste that in there, and that's all we need to do in that file. We also need to define how our repo, the details of our database on our system. And we do that, as it says, well, it created this config file to do repo.ex, and that's where we need to define our repo. So let's go in there. So lib/todo/repo. So lib/todo repo.ex, and this is where our repo is defined. Really, you don't need to touch this file. This file is created by Ecto. There are some things you could do in this file, but for us, we're just going to leave it alone. Instead, we're going to go back to our config file, config.config.es. And you can see we opened this file earlier to put in this line, and the stuff above it wasn't here, this config to do repo. But Mix created that for us, so it gives you some helper things. So in here, we just need to change a couple things to make it work on our system. The first is we want to make sure we are using Postgres, which is the default, and that's what we want to use. Our database, I'm just going to call this full stack to do. Username is Postgres, and oops, one S, and password out. Maybe it's Postgres. I can't remember if it's a password or not. Let's save that. We'll find out if that's the way to do it. Actually, I think it's no password. Let me delete that. OK, save that. And now we want to have that database created for us. And of course, Mix has a script or something we can use to do that. So we do mix ecto.create. It'll create that repo for us. So now we have a database in our local Postgres server running for us and ready for us to interact with. So the first thing we need to do is create a file that will basically model what we want to model. Since we're making a to-do application, let's make a to-do item, okay? So let's go back to Elixir. We're going to edit a new file. In this case, it's going to be to-do, or lib to-do item.ex. And here we need a def module, to-do.item, do use ecto schema. The ecto schema is basically something we're going to use in our file, in our module, to define how we want our table to look and our item to interact in our application. So in this case, we're going to say schema, and then we put in the name of the table we're going to use for this. In this case, we'll just use the plural items. And here we're going to define the fields that we're going to use. So the first field we're going to have is maybe title, and that's going to be a string. And let's also do completed, and that's going to be a Boolean. And then Ecto provides this nice thing called timestamps. So you don't have to put in that you want specific timestamp columns. It'll automatically create an updated at and inserted at column for you, which is really nice. So that's what we're going to do in that file. And outside of that, we are going to create a migration. So we've defined in our application how we want our items to interact with the database because we have that schema, but we haven't actually created that table in our database yet. That's what we want to do next. So we're going to use Mix to help us do that. So ecto gen migration, and we're going to name our migration. Let's just say create items. So that's what we're going to do. So again, it generated a to-do app. It created a migration called create items. So let's go open that up and we will get started on that. So we go to priv repo migration. create items. Okay, so if you're familiar with Rails, this will look very familiar. Basically, there's a change method, and you can, this in this case is a function, but you can also define a specific up and down function if you'd rather. But a change method function will tell Ecto how it needs to change the database from before you ran this migration to after. So in this case, we're trying to create this table. So we're going to say create table items, because that's what we decided to name it, do. And we're going to add a column called title, and it's going to be a string. And we're going to add a column called completed, and that's a Boolean. And we're also going to add those timestamps. Again, it provides that in there, which is real nice. So I'm going to open up over here on this other side my item. And you can see that this looks very familiar. So it's almost exactly mirrored, except for a couple different changes in wording. Instead of schema, we have create table. Instead of field, we have add. But everything else is very, very similar. In fact, it's exact, which is real nice because you know exactly how you're going to be interacting with your database. So now that we have that, let's migrate our database into that new version. Ecto.migrate. And we have a missing terminator end. Okay, so let's go do that. Yes, here we are. End. Now we'll migrate. And we have create table items. So this is good news on both fronts. We are interacting with our database correctly, so we have Ecto set up correctly in Elixir, and we have created that table in Postgres. So from there, let's just go straight into using it. So I'm running a little low on time, so I'm just going to dive in and show you how to create an item in here. So IEX is basically the REPL for Elixir, and we're the -s mix tells it we want to bring in our mix application into this shell session. So we can, I'm going to go to a couple things here real quick to make it easier on our typing. I'm going to alias a couple things. Item. So we can we can ask our repo, give us all the items. In this case, it gives you a little debug message, says, hey, you know what? I've got a list of 0 items to return to you. That's good. We haven't created any, but it's also good because the query was okay. So we are getting connectivity to our database, we're talking to it, it's talking back to us, we're getting things done. That's good. So let's insert an item. So repo insert. Let's create an item, and we'll title it, how about talk at full stack. And there we go. We inserted an item into our database. So now if we ask it to give us all our items, we can see we have this list with our to-do item in there. Another thing you'll notice is in our schema and in our migration, we didn't tell it to create an ID field, an ID column. Ecto does that automatically. It knows that you're going to want an ID field most of the time. You can override it and tell it not to create one for you. You can also override it to tell it what you want it to be named, because sometimes if you're interacting with old databases or databases from different systems, the ID field is not going to be named ID. It's going to be named something different. So you can specify that if you want to. But the default is, I'm just going to create an ID field for you because I know you're going to want it, and then we can go on from there. But you can tell it, it gave us a date time stamp for our inserted at, and it updated at too. And it gave us an ID. So that is in the database. There's a whole lot more in Ecto that we can go through, including change sets, which is a really cool thing in Ecto. But I'm going to skip that right now. A change set is basically, you use it to update items in the database, and with it, you can track all the changes. And so when you pass information through a change set, it'll track the different changes that you made to the particular item. In this case, item is a double meaning because we're changing items. And it also can use validation in there, and you can also do some data manipulation if you need to, like hashing passwords, things like that. So change sets are really cool. One of the things that I like about Elixir that really turned me off at the beginning was that it's very explicit. So I'm used to Rails and Ruby where there's a lot of things that aren't necessarily explicit. Things just happen a lot of times in Ruby and Rails. But in Elixir, you have to be very explicit with things. And so the change set I was like, why do I have to do all this extra typing to just update something in my database? But once you realize the power of it and the benefits of it, it'll be worth it, I guarantee. So one thing I want to do before I'm done here is I'm going to go into an old to-do application that I created and show you a couple different ways you can query the database. So you've seen the repo.all. And this particular database has a whole bunch of test information in there. When I gave this talk previously, we just added a bunch of random information in here just so we can do some fun queries. Jesse over there, the only guy who raised his hand when he asked if anyone used Elixir, I'm going to use him a little bit as an example, I guess, because that's some of the data I have in here. So we can do some powerful things in Ecto in terms of getting information out of it. So, for example, we can say repo1, actually let me import ecto.query, repo.1 from I in items. So we're going to look for item in our item table, and we're going to alias that to the I, or to I. Give me the, select the count for I to ID. Item schema, oh, it's because I didn't do aliases. All right, let me alias those real quick. Repo, save my typing for later. Item, let's try it again. Okay, so you can see that we've got 103 items right now in the database that we can play with. So we can ask it how many of those actually belong to Jesse. So we've got, in this case, we have users and items belong to users. And we also have something called estimated minutes, which will, actually, let's just show you that. So if I do item, you can see that we've modified the database in this particular application a little bit more. So we have estimated minutes, which is an integer we can use to figure out how long something is going to take. And we also have a user ID. So that provides that association. So if we want to find out how many of those belong to Jesse, we can say repo all from I in item. We use a join table, u and user. Actually, I didn't alias that yet, so to do dot user, where, again, the u from user name equals Jesse, and where u.id equals I.user ID. We want to select the count of the items. Let's see if that works. Okay, so 5 of those belong to Jesse. That doesn't sound right, but let's go with that. We can also do things. One of the cool things about Ecto as well is that the queries are composable, so you can build them up as you go. So let's say our query equals from I in item. So you can see that we have, it's an Ecto query object. It's not an object, but that's what it is. And from that, we can pass that through to more queries later on down the road and slowly build up our long query. If we have one that we need to build up dynamically or programmatically, if we need to change things based on user input, we can have the main portion of our query set and then query on that later. So, for example, let's do one that's real quick and then we'll be done. Let's look at average minutes. So repo.all from item, this time I'm gonna be a little bit more explicit. Item and item, join user and user. Again, I haven't aliased that. To do user on user.id equals item.user ID. Group by item user ID. So we're gonna group our things by the user. And we're going to select, and one of the cool things about select in Ecto is you can tell it how you want the data back. So in this case, I'm giving it, I said I want a map of the information, but you can also do like a tuple or a list, just a straight number like I did on the counts. But in this case, we're doing a map. So we're going to have our map be, we're going to return the user ID of the item.user ID, and then to-dos, we're going to have a count of those, item ID, and then we're going to say the average minutes. Another cool thing about Ecto is, again, I mentioned that you don't need to jump into SQL. You can if you need to, but it provides a whole lot of things that gives it it uses the database's power instead of Elixir's power. So in this case, we're going to just tell Postgres to average these columns for us. So we just say average item estimated minutes. All right, let's see if this works. There we go. So in this case, 123 minutes on average, 53 to-dos for user ID 3, and then 104 minutes for 49 to-dos for user 2. And we have these in maps that we defined for it. So really, that's all we have time for today. I want to point you to a couple of resources if you're interested in learning a bit more. My website is jeffreylessel.com. I've got a few different articles on Ecto up there. A lot of this was taken from an article I wrote called From Zero to Ecto in 10 Minutes. And it'll basically get you started with Ecto, and then I've got a few others in there that really go into using Ecto in depth. Also, I gave this talk at a San Diego Elixir meetup, so if you guys are interested in learning more about Elixir, I recommend checking that out. We meet in San Diego every month. But on GitHub, I put up a repo that basically build that application that took an hour and a half to build, and every commit in there is highly commented that goes through each step of the way that we built this application out. So if you guys want to check that out to get a little more info into how I jumped from the beginning to actually querying that database, then you can check that out. So that's all. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Gio. Does anyone have any questions?
Yes.
One question. Let's hold on for the mic real quick.
I'll play this back in just in case you need to see something.
So who uses Elixir, like in the real world?
Yeah, right now it's kind of a newish language. There are some shops that are starting to do all Phoenix instead of Rails. So Dockyard, for example, was a major one that was highly in Rails, and they've switched everything over to Phoenix. That's running on Elixir. There are a lot of telecommunication things that run on Erlang, which is what Elixir is built on. And Elixir is really just using the power of Erlang and making it more expressive. So if you saw a lot of my code, if you're familiar with Ruby, a lot of it looks like Ruby in the way it's formatted and the way it's, like, you got def and def module and things like that are very Ruby-ish, and you got do's and blocks and things like that. So the language itself lends itself to being expressive like Ruby is and easy to read, which is one of the reasons people are moving to it. But anyway, so like it's built on Erlang, and Erlang is a lot of telecommunication products. In fact, Erlang was built in the 70s, I think, 60s or 70s, and it's been running a long time on some of those systems. But again, I know there's some out there, and people ask me so a lot. I should get a list.
Elixir report,
yeah.
Those are a couple of big ones. Pinterest, yeah, okay.
Yeah, there's an app I use on my phone called Football Addicts. It's European football, so it's soccer, but their whole back end is built on Elixir. They're pretty big in Europe.
So is it faster speed versus like a...
Yes, Elixir, Erlang specifically is built to be, basically phone systems are built on Elixir. Like Ericsson made Erlang. That came out of Ericsson. So it was built to handle telecommunication systems. So if you think about it, like your landline, it never really goes down. Like if you need maintenance, you can't just shut your landline down. It's pretty good uptime for a landline. So they needed to make it highly fault tolerant and fail elegantly and quickly if there's a failure. And like I talked about the supervisors, so we'll start up new children as needed. So that's one of the things that's really cool about it. And because of that, so Elixir is built on that. So that's also very fault tolerant. It also spins up little processes. So it's built basically for modern systems. So like Ruby, like thread safety is a huge issue in Ruby. You've got to really work around making sure that your code is thread safe. And even when you do that, it's still not very performant. Whereas Elixir is built from the ground up to take advantage of those cores. In fact, there's multiple different examples out there you can find of them spinning up like hundreds of thousands of processes. And a process doesn't necessarily tie to like a CPU process, but each Elixir process or Erlang process is like a 2 kilobyte original process that it can run, and it's got its own system of managing all those. And it's really kind of cool how many of those you can do. So you can spin off async requests and wait for things, and it's very incredible the speed that you can do some things that in Ruby would take a long time. Another cool thing, if we wanted to sell you on Elixir, is it's got pattern matching, which you didn't show any at all in this, but you can, in your function definitions, match on patterns of parameters or arguments. So for example, if you have a function named average and you passed in a float, you can pattern match, def average when the argument is a float, and then do everything you need to in there. But then let's say you passed in some number you made up or an integer even. You can also make another function, define another function, def average, with an integer, when it's an integer. And you can do all those cascading different functions based on what happens when you pass different information. And it gets even crazier the further you go into it. But anyway, obviously I like Elixir. Any other questions?
Yeah,
yes?
What's the open source community like so far? A lot of things like Ecto kind of available right now?
Yeah, so one of the cool things I mentioned about Elixir is the documentation. So hex.pm is kind of like, I I don't know, it's where all the modules are hosted for Elixir. But you can go to Ecto, and then we go like the online documentation. And so you can see the documentation is pretty good for just Ecto, and this is just like the initial page. So there, like, in fact, there was a typo in one of these that I just, I went on GitHub and submitted a pull request, and they submitted it. They merged it within it was within the day. I think it was even less than 12 hours. But they were very thankful, and they were like, shut up, that. And where we come from, we put the I's after the E's, or whatever. They were very, very nice. There's also a Slack group for Elixir that's very active. That's also very friendly. If you have any issues, you can go in there and say, hey, I just don't know what I'm doing here on this particular thing, and they can help you figure out what's going on. In fact, the creator of Elixir and the creator of Phoenix are both very active in different forums, and even in the Slack group, I think I've seen them on there. Yeah, super helpful. Any other questions? Cool. Well, I recommend you guys go check out Elixir and Ecto, because Ecto is a good way to get started on little command line projects. So, thanks again.